this is part of what I think I was trying to talk about with Brendan Graham Dempsey, like this idea that the God that you put in a box is not God because it's in a box.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you look inside the box, you're not gonna God can't be there because that God in the box is gonna let you down because as soon as you try to trap him, like he's outside.
Yeah.
I wrote a poem. I was gonna share it real fast.
Yeah.
This is one of the early poems I wrote like 2 months ago when I started writing poetry. But I built an iron box, the walls lined with lead. In it, there are no flaws, no holes, no gaps, no seams. 128 guards circle my brilliant cage, around and around without end. All of my efforts empty as my grand prison. I could not keep love in its walls. And that's the image is the and I think in our conversation too we talk about this image of descending like Dante into the underworld, and he has a different view of how this goes, but in my perspective is that at the bottom you see your false gods, the ones that you followed, the ones that you thought would give you everything, and you realize they weren't actually they weren't benevolent. They were just trying to bring you down.
And so the idea is that the sacred involves some relationship to ultimacy that we find transformative, and that we find grounds our judgments of value and or virtue. And what has been provocative is people have been suggesting, and this came up in Beyond Nihilism, Paul Tillich, the God beyond the God of theism is what is being born right now in order to respond to the meaning crisis. Or you have Robert Carter in his astonishing book, The Nothingness Beyond God, that the Kyoto School, especially in Nishitani, were trying to point to something like this as well. We could have a relationship to ultimacy that is transformative and grounding of our cultivation of virtue and value, but is nevertheless something other or beyond at least a standard notion, a shared standard notion, at least across the Abrahamic religions, of what we mean by God. Now, many of you may say, but those traditions also talk about the God beyond God, Eckhart, and the Godhead, or God. I pray to God that He free me from God, and that, of course, will come up in the course. What could Eckhart mean by that?
Creatio continua, continuous creation. That God is creating now. Right? God didn't just create in the past and then wind it up and let it go. But in each moment, God is holding in being all that exists, right? And thus, all that exists can return to a unity with God. And that's where we're headed with Eckhart, as we were with Dionysius. This is the spiritual life, right? When we talk about God creating things then, or when we talk about any created thing at all, right, we can only refer those things to God by analogy, And here we're back in the terrain of that negative theology, right? God is good. Right? Yes, we say, God is good, right? Because we are devout Christians or Muslims or Jews or whomever might believe in God, right? What Eckhart is saying is that even that seemingly fundamental characterization, God is good, is not fundamental enough, because what God is in God's essence goes beyond our human concept of goodness, right? God's essence cannot be positively spoken. No created thing can fully reveal to us what God is or who God is in God's self. Let's take a look at a couple of passages. We're not going to do this after all of them, but just for the first two, I want to connect what we just said with the text from Davies, which I believe to be instructive. So on oneness, returning to that theme of oneness, Eckhart affirms that he does indeed find the notion of the one the most adequate way of speaking of God. All else that you could say about God, right? God is good, God is all-powerful, etc. All other characterizations appear to, quote, add something to God, right? And therefore to conceal him. You're putting these concepts onto a reality, God, that is essentially one and can only be kind of hidden by those attributions of those characteristics. Oneness alone comes close to capturing something of God's essence in language, without clothing him in concepts, which seem to owe more to our nature than to his. Right? So only the concept of one, Eckhart thinks, does not conceal God's essence. That comes as close as any human concept can come to expressing adequately who or what God is. About creation, looking at that second theme. For Eckhart, Davies writes, creation cannot be said to have occurred within time, since time itself did not pre-exist the created order. This whole world is the created order. The creation is not an event located in the remote past whose consequences we experience today, but is rather an ongoing and dynamic process. Right? And I would highlight this is not some kind of, obscure fringe corner of Christianity. This is the teaching, at least, of the Catholic Church. We're talking about the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? But it's not often conveyed adequately to people who are learning that tradition, unless, of course, they begin to read in these authors or to carry out a really deep practice of prayer.
And again, I'm going to say this again, right? I'm aware of people like Eckhart and Dionysius and Maximus and John Scotus Erigena, right? Who the God beyond God, the Godhead beyond God, and all of that. In fact, I'm in the process of starting to produce a series that's going to be called "The God Beyond God," reinventing the sacred for the modern era.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so because I think this question is a crucial question.
So maybe part of the problem is that because it is so embedded in our collective unconscious, divinity is really hard to, it's the sticking point.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I agree.
Yeah.
And so I hope you don't think I'm being dismissive of the people I'm challenging. I respect what they're doing, but I do also take very seriously, the Heideggerian critique that it's a fundamental mistake to understand the ground of being as a supreme being. That's what he calls ontotheology. And what he means by that is it's not just a way of thinking about God, it's a way of thinking about being.
Yeah.
Fundamentally mistaken. It's a way of thinking that what relevance realization is the detection of relevance, and that's not what it is. And that's what I wanted to ask you. So, what do you think about my proposal that relevance realization is this dynamic transjective thing, analogous to evolution? I
love the word transjective. I think that's a fabulous word to describe it. I really, really like that a lot on many levels. But okay, let's go to your last number 33.
Right.
What is really uncanny about that is that pre-intellectual awareness of relevance.
I thought you'd like that. That's why I wanted
love that. And that pre-intellectual thing I think is the key, because that means if it's pre-intellectual, then you're not engaging in it at all with the actual moment. It does not engage with all that stuff from the past. In the analogy, my favorite analogy in that book is the boxcars and the train on the track of quality. It's so apt because it describes the totality. So you don't have your boxcars when you feel the spark of quality. All you feel is
the cutting edge of the train. Is that
cutting edge of the train? But as soon as it's conscious, then those get involved. So it's kind of like coupling with the world.
Right.
The actual experience of quality is removed from anything except quality. It is that in itself.
Referring specifically to the nature of order, you see, it's very, very difficult to deal with the nature of order properly without talking about God. I lectured on the nature of order for years, wrote the books. Most of that time I myself did not speak about God. I very, very, very rarely so much as mentioned that subject in the lecture room. I think there was a certain sense that it was inappropriate. And I'm embarking now on a a view of the world where the question of what is the nature of God can be discussed, thought about, considered critically. One doesn't need to make exaggerated statements about it. One doesn't need to, believe in visitations from the Virgin Mary. One does need to consider what is the nature of wholeness in the universe and what are the conditions under which wholeness grows. What is wholeness? And the answers to that straightforward question cannot be given by mechanistic thought modes. So the problem is, there is this thing of how the greater whole works. I'm personally quite convinced that it cannot be subjected to analysis by primitive mechanism. On the other hand, I'm also convinced that it can be approached through rational, even mathematical thought. It deals with real phenomena, and as I say, these phenomena gradually, they gradually sort of go in transition towards touching such questions as the nature of God. And you may say, well, but what if God doesn't exist? What if this is all hoo-ha? Well, the point is that there are these phenomena of wholeness, which is the most important of all of them. If you rule out forms of explanation, even observations of certain kind of phenomena, and do not allow yourself to tell, as far as you can, the exact truth about what is going on in these cases, but only allow those things to be said which can be handled in a mechanistic framework, at this point you're simply doing bad science. It's not, you can't do, science has to do with knowledge. So there's this huge gray area, and it's which doesn't so much have to do with spooks and poltergeists. It has to do with very fascinating things about how the whole acts, and how and at the moment, for instance, there's been a belief in the last decade or so that you can understand how the whole behaves as a result of complex interactions between many particles, or if you want to view some complex system as a cellular automaton, that by in effect programming the way that the different cells interact in that cellular automaton, one can hope to realize the behavior of something in a holistic fashion. Now, there's a severe limitation on that. It is true that some apparently holistic phenomena can be simulated like that and can be reached like that, but there are other far greater issues where the whole is acting, where at the moment there is absolutely no probability in sight of being able to explain them in that simple-minded way. And yet, if we're dealing with such topics as you were raising a little while ago about people's well-being and so forth, the wholeness that is necessary to make a human being deeply grounded and at one with the world around, that is not within the reach of mechanistic explanations. But it is not only a subtle, but also a very important problem which needs to be tackled head-on by whatever means it takes to come to terms with it. And in The Nature of Order, going back to that book for a moment, I laid some of the first steps of a path that goes in that direction. And as I said, I'm now embarked on a series of new books, about 7 or 8 of them, which will try to complete the journey and actually make clear how all this necessarily fits together.
You mentioned the problem of compartmentalization, and you pointed out that really that's bad science, because ultimately you can't compartmentalize. You might get a nice, it might be a nice trick for a while, but sooner or later you've got to start integrating these areas of knowledge. And isn't that what you're saying when you're talking about God, that we have compartmentalized under this category of God all the things that have to do with the wholeness of life, the meaning of life, the beauty of life, the divinity of life, and trivialized it in a way by saying, well, that's just something that's over in the corner. And go ahead.
No, you're quite right. I think that kind of compartmentalization is drastically dangerous, and it's. I mean, the idea that it's okay to do physics, but that God has to be kept behind closed doors, is ludicrous in view of, if you think about the very extraordinary proposals that are currently being made in contemporary physics, they're more far out in many ways than any religious thought ever was. There is absolutely no reason to erect that sort of barrier, and it's really just a pretense. It's based on wishful thinking about what you can do with mechanistic explanations. And I think to this day, a lot of scientists can't quite go there. That is, they would like to pursue the explanations of the phenomena they encounter, but they restrict plausible or acceptable explanations to those that can be formulated in a mechanistic way.
Materialist scientists who are looking at evolution just aren't looking deeply enough to get at things like that.
Yeah, I think they're just ultimately being dishonest.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, they like I said, there are things going on in their psychology, and by the way, in their neurology, that they are ultimately intentionally, although they may not be aware of the fact that this is happening, denying that fact of occurring. And so they claim that they are reaching conclusions without actually giving respect and noticing the things that are actually occurring to get to that conclusion, and therefore think that they can actually sit entirely within this world. And so they are producing a model of reality that is in fact not an accurate model of reality. And if they pay honest, close attention to their own experience or to the actual underlying science of how thinking works, they would know that that is not an accurate model of reality. And so it's ultimately a form of dishonesty, because the noticing of it is ultimately there. I've done this myself. Like, you go through any form of meditation practice and you just sort of slow down until you begin to notice. You're like, oh yeah, that was there. I just skipped over it. I felt the upwelling of the feeling of what it feels like to perceive a pattern as being this click. Yeah, that's always a precursor to any. When I say, does 1 + 1 = 2? And they say, yeah, of course. Okay, why of course? What's happening in the process where you get to the of courseness of it? Well, there's something going on, and it's a noticeable thing. And if you pay close enough attention to it, if you slow down, if you don't skip over it, if you don't ideologically prevent yourself from actually having an honest relationship with your own personal experience, you'll notice it. And by the way, we can prove it with fMRIs. So you can go either direction, but that's what's happening, because the ideology, the model, is incoherent, demonstrably incoherent, and also doesn't map to phenomenology. So yes, that is my diagnosis and my accusation.
Well, it's because it's really interesting to me. Like, one time I had a conversation, or it might have been one I was watching, with Ian McGilchrist and Michael Levin talking to each other. And and obviously Michael Levin understands all this biology stuff, even at a deeper level than McGilchrist does. But McGilchrist brought up an example of when a deer sheds, when a stag when a stag sheds, oh, maybe deer also have antlers. I can't remember.
Deer is the general, stag is the male.
Yeah, but do they
Joe
both
is the
have antlers? Yeah. Anyways, one of them sheds its antlers. Okay. And all that's left after they shed the antlers is this little knob kind of on their heads. And the next year, when those antlers come back, they are identical in every respect.
Mm.
But every animal has a different set of antlers, completely unique to that animal. But when that animal's antlers come back the next season, they are identical in every respect. So even if that animal suffers a damage to the antler and the antler grows a little spur to protect itself where the damage was, when that one falls off in the next season, it comes back with that spur.
Nice.
So McGilchrist is saying, where is that information stored so that when it comes back exactly perfect? And that is kind of the same question that Levin has been asking about a lot of these things, about like when a planaria gets cut in half, if he sends it a different kind of a signal, it will build a second head instead of a tail. Or even when it's building a head, if you cut it in half, the tail will also restore the whole planaria, head and brain and everything included, even although all that was there before was the tail.
Right.
So where is that information stored? It's not stored in the DNA. So where is that information stored? So he has come face to face with this question, and yet he's unwilling to accept that maybe there's something that we're not capable of understanding without love and hope and faith as a foundation for the understanding.
Yeah.
And that's not the same thing as calling it the God of the gaps.
No. This is definitely not the same thing. In fact, it's exactly the reverse, right? The God of the gaps, what the God of the gaps says is it still talks about understanding as being, or epistemology, as being the proper faculty. And then what it says is within the category of understanding, there are gaps to our understanding. That's where God is. And I'm saying, no. In fact, almost exactly the inverse. Understanding is the gap. Like understanding is this little sliver in this much larger milieu of that we can describe, right? Again, love, hope, faith. If necessary, we could spend time actually talking about it at a neurophysiological level, like what's actually going on here. Certainly at a cognitive level, even just to get to the notion of understanding as a piece that sits on top of it. As we go down that stack, we'll begin to expand our metaphysics to include other characteristics than the strictly material. And we'll have to use that substrate to do that properly. See, this right here, that's the sleight of hand. If you are intuitively, notice the word intuitively, right? Precognitively, non-defensively on a purely rational basis, choosing to presage the rational toolkit, and that part of your anatomy, by the way, to engage in your relationship with the whole of reality, then you've already preordained an entire set of conclusions, which, by the way, is, what would you call that? Cheating? Something like that. Illegitimate. Right? A good scientist wouldn't even accept that as a premise. You're smuggling a whole bunch of stuff that is simply part of the way, the underlying epistemological frame that you're using, and again, the faculties that you're participating in. And I'm going through the same loop, but it's useful because we've kind of spent some time together. Once you acknowledge that that's happening, you can say, well, what's happening at this deeper substrate? What's that? What's going on there? And what's in it? Well, you can't use this to describe this, right? That's logically impossible. I can't use a weaker logic to describe a stronger logic. This is a bigger category, and it contains other stuff, but we have access to this. In just the same way that we have access to understanding, we have access to faith. We're humans happen to have that. And every artist is unconcerned with that. They're like, yeah, I can't think through and analytically describe the rational purpose behind why I actually went up and created this particular tone or art, but it's obviously true. But I wasn't like I was just random. Like there was something going on that my faculty of artistry gave me the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, and more or less beautiful. Right? That's a thing. It's not random. It's not capricious. Right? It's actually no less random and capricious than truth is, and it's a deeper substrate that includes a much larger portion of reality with which we can come into relationship. right? So, and it governs it. Again, every time that I believe that I've identified something as true, I've said, oh, yes, that's a cup. That's 1 + 1 = 2. I notice, if I take the time, that the faculty of beauty is actually happening first, and then the faculty of understanding is sitting on top of that and doing stuff with that, right? It's naming it, it's articulating it, it's clothing it in a variety of different forms that allow me to do the things with it, right? I can now rotate that back out, feed it back into this faculty, and come back up with other stuff. I can do math, but I'm doing math by means of this larger complex. And so that's the point, right? Once you get to that, then you can say, okay, what does it look like for me to begin to intentionally orient and cultivate here? How do I get a deeper, stronger faith? How do I broaden that faith and begin to notice what aspects of faith are currently outside of the vertical of my limited understanding, and begin to make choices from beyond my understanding, from a deeper place than my own understanding, but not, again, arbitrary, capricious, or illusory, but actually in some sense even more fundamental. Not in some sense, in a very profound sense, more fundamental. And of course, this is very, very helpful, because then it allows us to even ground hope